Walt's how-tos and reviews. Today, I'm going to show you how to install vinyl plank flooring onto your floor. I'm making this video because when I did it, I watched a bunch of videos and I felt like there was a lot of important information lacking. Like, for instance, what if it's not just a rectangular room? What if you're doing hallways with multiple rooms and all has to come together? Where is the best place to start? And what's the reasoning behind that? And what's the math to know, how big of a strip to start with and where to start? All that kind of stuff is going to be coming up. So stay tuned. Feel free to use the timeline to skip ahead. But again, I'm kind of making this from, hey, if I would have watched this video before I did it, would have helped me do it in the most efficient manner, but also giving that professional look like a pro came in here and did it. And I think I figured out all those tips and tricks and I'm gonna give them all to you right now. I'm gonna cover everything that you absolutely need and then I'll go over some optional stuff and explain why it's optional and how you can get away without using it. But if you've got the extra tools lying around, you're definitely gonna wanna use them. Now obviously you're gonna need the actual flooring, and in some cases you might need an underlayment. And I can make a whole video on which ones to go with and the pros and cons just on that, so you can do your research there. Cool, so first thing is you're gonna need spacers for the outer edges. Now, most of the kits and stuff have this kind of spacer, but to be honest, for vinyl plank flooring, these suck. Do not get these. You get a T-style type, it's gonna make the install way easier and better. So you can just put it on your vinyl plank, line it up there, and it just saves a lot of time with taping. Okay, so you're gonna need some kind of pull bar. And it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be fancy. You have cheap little ones that come in a kit, it's gonna work, it's gonna be fine. The idea is when you get up close to an edge, you can't use your mallet or hammer to hammer that back edge because there's a wall there. So you just have to be able to throw this guy on that edge there, and then you can use your hammer over here. It just moves where you're hammering from here over to here. You need something to be able to do it. You absolutely are gonna need it. So these seams come together as shown here, and you need to really push them with a good amount of force to get them to actually lock and stay together. Now, the reason you don't want to just hammer on the edge is when you hammer on the edge, you're gonna break the locking mechanism so the next board can't lock in. So they have little blocks that work well, and then when you're actually locking it into place, I would take this big block. A lot of times, like I said, I just use my hand and that would be enough, but sometimes it's a little stubborn, so I put it almost at an angle like that so that it's just pushing up against there, and then just nice little taps, get it in there. So the next thing is you're going to need a way to hammer these in. Now, you probably could get away with just a rubber mallet. These are like $5 or $6. For these edge seams where the two boards come together on the end, use the mallet just to lock it in place and get it smooth because you're actually hitting here. You don't want to hit it with a hard metal piece that's a really small surface area because you might actually dent the plastic, the vinyl. So this just softens the blow but gets the job done. Definitely gonna need a measuring tape. You're gonna need some kind of way to mark on your vinyl floor when you're doing intricate cuts, where you're gonna make your cuts. So a pencil works good for that. Here's something that's optional that I find to be way easier. You can use a Sharpie. And depending on the color of your floor, since I got black and white kind of going on, I used a red Sharpie to make all my marks and all my cuts. Now, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, you're crazy using a red Sharpie, but alcohol and a paper towel will actually wipe that up. I'm talking even months afterwards, it'll work, and it's much easier to see, much easier to write with. The next thing you'll need to make your cuts, and I guess you could argue you could use a saw every time, but really this is using a razor blade. It's a real big time saver and you definitely want to use it. Most people have a razor blade. Now, the rest of this stuff you could argue is optional, and I'm going to explain why you could argue it's optional, but also why it's important and why you probably want to use it. Now, you need to go to your door frames, and it depends, you might be in the situation where you removed old flooring and you've got plenty of space to fit stuff under the door. That was actually my situation. So I didn't have to cut any of the door jambs, the bottom of them, so that I could get the vinyl plank underneath there. However, if you already have tile and you're not gonna remove the tile and you're just gonna put the vinyl plank over it and it's already flush with the tile, you're gonna have to cut out a small piece of your door frame so that you can slide the vinyl plank under there and make it look nice. Put the vinyl down on the door frame, make your mark, or just leave it there if you have a tool and just cut in there so hey, it's gonna slide right underneath. But you could use something as cheap as a little hacksaw. I'll put some links in the description, and it's just gonna take more time. You're gonna make all the cuts that are possible with this guy. And unless you're doing a perfectly square room and somehow the door frame's not gonna be an issue for you, to where it just worked out to where you don't really need to make anything other than just straight cuts, you might get away with this. And you can actually do all the cuts with a jigsaw. I think these are like 50 to 70 bucks, but definitely get some more blades if you're gonna be making all your cuts with this. I mean, if you're ripping boards, meaning it's a long board and you're cutting it the long ways with a jigsaw, it's gonna work. Just take your time, but you'll probably wanna pick up a couple blades because they will start to get dull if you're doing a lot of cuts like that. Now, obviously, if you happen to have a table saw, use that to make your rips. It's gonna make your life and job way easier. And if you have, you know, circular saw, chop saw, those all come in handy when needed, but a lot of times you're making all your cuts, boom, and then if you've got weird things like your intricate door jamb cuts or just the different things that are gonna come up, this is gonna be the tool of choice. That I would almost argue that you need this, but what's nice is this is the only saw that you're gonna absolutely need. The other saws aren't necessary, they're just gonna make it a little easier and quicker, that's all. Now, I definitely think you should remove the baseboards. And the biggest reason is just when I go to nice homes, I don't see a little cord around hiding the edges because they put down, you know, hardwood or vinyl plank. And, you know, a crowbar, a flathead screwdriver, a paint 5-in-1 or like, you know, plaster scraper are all gonna be handy. You're gonna cut the caulking with your razor blade. You're gonna wanna be able to get behind there and then get some leverage. You're gonna need something thin to be able to get in there. And if you don't have something like that, I would just get the baseboard remover because, you know, the wider it is, the more it's gonna pull the whole board back versus just one little section. Like if you use just a crowbar, it's gonna make the tendency to break your trim. So try to go really slow, take your time, especially if you're gonna be putting the trim back on, you know, don't break the trim. A drill is something that I would definitely recommend. A lot of times the wall isn't straight, so you're actually gonna wanna create a straight line on the floor by using the anchor method that I showed. And you're gonna need a drill and screws to take your little piece and drill it in so that that piece can't move. All right, as shown here. Now, unfortunately, if it is the situation like me and you're actually working on a concrete slab instead of a wooden floor, you're gonna need a special kind of drill, which is called a hammer drill. I got this one at Home Depot. I think it was the cheapest one there is why I got it, because I'm not gonna use it much, but it was about 50, 60 bucks, and you need a concrete drill bit, because if you try to use a concrete drill bit and not a hammer drill, I mean, it's not gonna work. You're gonna be there for hours and half the screws probably won't even stick. And then you're gonna need special concrete screws to be able to hold those in. So again, that is optional because you can get away without doing it. You could argue that you don't need a square because they say keep like a 1/4 inch distance off the wall. And I bet, you know, you could even use anything straight, and you know, you could just use this that's straight, and you could probably eyeball it and get a nice cut there, and you'll probably be all right. So you don't need a square, but if you have, you know, a speed square sitting around or a square, it just makes it easy because you can slap it on the vinyl. You've got a nice, perfectly straight line, break out your razor blade, and it just makes it a lot easier. Okay, now here's something that's totally unnecessary, but I find super helpful for a lot of jobs. And I'm sure if you're, you know, a framer or something, you'll probably laugh like that's not a tool belt. But what I'm using it for is just pockets, but you'll find when you have all this stuff, you've got all these different things, your pockets get filled pretty quick. You've got all these spacers. If you have some kind of little cheap tool belt or even a nice one, you know, load up a couple pockets with spacers, have your Sharpie in the same spot, have everything ready to go, and you'll find it makes the job way more efficient. Because if you're like me, you know, you get going and then it's like, wait, where did I put the razor blade? Where did I put my marker? Where did I put this? And I spend, you know, so much time just looking for my tools. But I try to just, when I'm doing a project, get in the habit, put everything in the same spot. It's all on me. It makes me way more efficient. But again, completely unnecessary. All right, last thing that's unnecessary but super helpful is knee pads. All right, you don't need them. You're fine. You're gonna be on your knees a lot though, hammering in and stuff. And, you know, if you're doing a really small room, you'll probably be fine. But if you're gonna be doing it a while, these are gonna make you a lot more comfortable. Step 1, obviously you have to get the rooms ready to install the flooring on. Since it's the floor, if it's possible, removing everything that's on the floor per room is gonna make your job a lot easier. There's different kinds of flooring you might currently have. If you have a laminate or linoleum like this, or if you have tile like this, it is possible to put the vinyl plank flooring over that, I would just double check with your manufacturer's instructions, and it's going to be a lot easier than removing something like tile. Just keep in mind, when you transition from one room to another, the flooring might not be level and you'll have to use like a reducer transition, which may not be optimal for what you're actually wanting. Just keep that in mind before you proceed. If you have carpet, you're definitely going to need to remove that, as well as the padding and the tacking strips along the edging before you put down the laminate flooring. Just take a razor blade, cut up the carpet into strips, roll them up, and do the same thing with the padding. For the tacking along the edges, a crowbar and a hammer works really well. Just make sure to wear eye safety. The wood chips and nails tend to fling up towards your face. The next step is going to be removing the baseboards. It is possible not to remove them, and you can just put more trim on the bottom, like a quarter round, but unless you do that to your whole house, it's not going to match, and I've never seen that in really nice, modern, high-end homes. I just don't think it looks professional and clean, so for me, gotta remove the baseboards. The two most important things when removing the baseboards is be sure not to break them, go slow, take your time. The other thing is, it's almost impossible to put them back in the same order where they're supposed to be if you don't label them. So make sure you use some kind of labeling system, like B for bedroom, K for kitchen, and I would work in a clockwork fashion from a door frame, labeling B1, B2, B3, some way that you know, how am I going to put this back together? Take a little time now to save a lot of time later. You might notice in the video I didn't label my baseboards and I broke them. It's because I was planning on replacing them, because my wife's lovely cat peed along the edges of the rooms, as you can see here on the carpet. So for me, I had to replace all the baseboards because that was just disgusting. The next step is you need to make sure your floor is level. The best and easiest way to do this is to get something really long and straight, such as an I-beam level or a box level. Lay it down on your floor and make sure that it lays flat everywhere. Now if it doesn't, you're going to want to address that. And there are whole long videos that'll explain how to level a floor, so I didn't want to cover that. However, vinyl plank flooring, it's a hard surface when you walk on it, but it's also a flexible flooring, so if you put it over a screw that's popping up, you're gonna feel that with your foot when you walk over it. Now, I took care of the big stuff like that drain plug and some areas that were really unlevel with my floor. However, I didn't do the entire floor, and I can say firsthand, if you don't, it is gonna be noticeable and you will feel it. Will other people notice it? That's debatable, but I can show you there are a couple places on my floor, like right here, where the end seam actually pops up because I didn't self-level the floor. So it's a very important step. I figured because I was laying down a cork underlayment, it would be just enough cushion to help hide those indiscrepancies, but as I just mentioned, I can definitely tell the floor isn't level, and if I could do it over again, I would have taken the extra time to level it. The next step is to determine whether or not you need to put down an underlayment. Some vinyl plank flooring will actually come with one pre-installed on the back side, and just follow the manufacturer's instructions depending on which substrate you're covering and what product you're using. If you need to put down an underlayment, there's a bunch of different options you can use. Now, in my basement, I had high radon gas readings, so I wanted to put down something that would help prevent that gas creeping up from my concrete floor. That's why I went with two, and this first one is just a thin 6mm polyethylene plastic to help keep that radon gas from creeping up. The second one I chose was in a roll, and it was a cork material that's gonna have three things. It's gonna help dampen noise, it's gonna give a little bit of cushion, and it's water resistant. Your underlayment is either gonna come in a roll or fold it up in an accordion-like fashion like this. Now, the roll, when you lay it down, the edges are going to want to come up. So if you have something heavy to put there, it'll definitely help with the install. I also found that, especially for the edges, duct tape seemed to hold it down the best. If you do use the type that's folded up like this, it will make your install quicker and easier. Now you're ready to determine which way you're going to lay your floor. But before you do that, I wanted to show you a really helpful tool. I put this link in the description, but this is a really helpful website. If you come down here to Open Room Visualizer, and then you click on this button here, you just need to upload a picture of the room or floor you're trying to install your vinyl plank flooring on, and then it looks like I already did it, so it has it here. Doesn't take very long. It uploads a picture. I was really surprised. You did a really good job of picking up where the floor is and putting it on there for you. You can test out, how do you like different colors. I just found this to be super helpful. The biggest thing that's going to be the most help in my opinion is this rotate surface. So you can see these boards are going vertical, and then we click that and now they're going to be going horizontal. So it can really help you visualize what is going to look the most aesthetically pleasing to you, and there's just no substitute to being actually able to see it and visualize it. Here is a mock-up of my basement. When determining which way to lay the floor, really beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so it's totally up to you, and there is no absolute truth on what's the right or wrong way to do this. However, with that being said, one day this house is probably going to be for sale. Even if it isn't for 100 years, one day it most likely will be. And if you're trying to make it as valuable as possible, if you lay it down a way that's most aesthetically pleasing to the masses, it will be more desirable, therefore making it higher demand and increasing its value. So with that being said, I wanted to give you some guidelines and a couple pointers that a lot of people will say when they're talking about what's the best way to lay the floor. So the first thing I wanted to say is which wall is the longest. And when they say wall, they're talking about an exterior wall that can be completely connected. So in this case, this wall right here running this way is actually longer than the wall that goes across the bottom here. So therefore, according to that model, the best way to run your boards is going to be this way. Okay. Now, along those same lines, another thing is the longest line of sight. So in this case, if you're standing here and you look down this way, you can see that's only 4 foot long, and you actually hit a wall right here. So you could argue the line of sight, if you're standing here and looking down this way, is longer. However, if you keep looking, you'll find that the actual longest line of sight is if you stand here and look down this way through this door. That's going to be your longest line of sight. And since this is a stairway up to the upstairs, you can actually stand at the top of the stairs and look all the way down to this back wall. And in that case, the longest line of sight happens to be the same as the longest exterior wall. So it's making my decision a lot easier, plus just the fact that I think it would look best this way. You can see how this is all tying in. So a couple other things to consider is the point of entry into the room, the floor, or the home. So if we're only doing one room in this case, and you were to walk through this door, the point of entry, to have them parallel, the boards would be going this way. If you're doing the main floor of your home, when you walk through your door, if you have line of sight all the way to the back wall and you have like a hallway there, a lot of times people will recommend laying the boards down that way. However, if we pretend that this spot right here is the front door, you walk in and boom, you hit a wall. In that case, it wouldn't be recommended. The way that we enter this floor from the upstairs is coming down the stairs, and the point of entry, if we lay them down parallel, now we're 3 for 3 on the longest wall, longest line of sight, and point of entry. The last thing I'll talk about is the lighting. Let's pretend that this office is a big living room, and this whole back wall is just a bunch of windows. And the sun sets or rises over here, so when it's coming up or coming down in the sun, there's lots of beams of light coming through these windows. A lot of times people will recommend having those boards go parallel to the lines. Now this is a basement. There is a window here, 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 and back over here. So it's 50-50, and since it's a basement, there isn't a ton of light, and that really doesn't come into play. But I did want to mention that because you will hear that. Now, there is one other option that really isn't available when you're installing vinyl plank flooring, and that's because it has a tongue and groove locking mechanism. The long way of this room, we could put it this way, and the hallway, we could put them down this way. Wooden floor, like real wood, you don't need a transition piece, and it is possible to do that, to have them going opposite directions. In my opinion, though, I just don't like that look, to just have it all of a sudden right here switch directions. And furthermore, if you're using vinyl plank flooring, because of that locking tongue and groove mechanism where the end of the board has to go into another board and lock, you can't actually do that without putting a transitions piece there. And having transition pieces in between the rooms, it's raised up, so you're going to stub your toe. It's just an obstacle that's in the way if you are trying to push something across the floor or mop it. It's a place for dirt and dust to collect, and I just don't think it looks aesthetically pleasing. So when you're talking about vinyl plank flooring or just any kind of flooring and you don't want to have transitions and you don't want to have it go one way in one area and a different way in another area, you need to lay down the flooring all the way for the entire floor of that particular home. So longest line of sight, longest wall, and point of entry is all telling me to lay my boards down this way, and I definitely do think that was the most aesthetically pleasing when I use the visualizer and check things out. So that's the way I'm going to run it. The next step is to determine which corner you're going to start and finish in. When you're installing vinyl plank flooring, you install it like you'd read a book, meaning you're going to start in the top left-hand corner and you're going to finish in the bottom right-hand corner. The reason for that is when you lay down a board, the end of the board is going to connect to the next board with a locking mechanism, and it's going to connect better if you do it from left to right as opposed to right to left. There might be some different vinyl plank flooring out, but for most of them, that's how it's going to be. So when we're looking at my diagram here, since we know we're going to be installing this direction, there are two places to start. Right here, and then we'll be installing like this and work our way all the way down till we finish here. Or we can start here and start installing and then work our way down till we finish here. Now, it really doesn't matter which way you do it, but the biggest thing you want to do is limit how much you need to work backwards. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If we were to start here in this mudroom, we're going to install flooring here, then here, then here, work our way down till we get to this doorway. Then we'll install a board that goes all the way here. But all of this area has not been installed. So now we're going to have to lay boards and work our way backwards up here. The other option is you start laying another board here and hope that these are the exact same size and that by the time you end up here, this board connects, which is very dangerous, and a lot of times, I mean, even if you're off by a 1/16 of an inch, it's going to make a big difference. This wall might not be perfectly straight. It's just really difficult. So the safest way, if you are going to do it that way, is to work your way backwards. The alternative is if we start in this corner, we start installing boards, and then we go through this hallway, we come here, and then we have some boards there, and then you can go down and you can finish here, and then you can keep coming down here and finish here. So we only have to work backwards that little area right there. Let me give you another example to help you visualize this. Let's say you're installing and you decide to install your boards the long ways, this way. Now, if we were to start here and start installing boards, you can see you work your way down, you get all the way to this hallway and you install one long board there, and you go through here. Now you have to work backwards all through these rooms here, which is a lot of working backwards, and you don't want to do that. Now let's look at the alternative. If we were to start in this corner and installing boards, and then you're going to have to work backwards up this way a little bit, but once you get that one board there, you can continue working your way down, and you're going to have to work backwards here, and you're going to have to work backwards there. Much less working backwards. All right, so let's imagine for a second that this is how wide our boards are, and they're really not this wide. This is just for demonstration purposes. And if we start laying in the top left corner of the gym room and we put that first board down, you can see by the time we get to the right side of the gym room, we have a very little sliver left of a board, and we want to avoid that, especially when it's just a rectangular room. So they're going to say cut that first board. Now we've got half a board at the beginning and half a board at the end of the gym, which is going to look a lot more aesthetically pleasing. But you'll notice when you're doing an entire floor, now at the beginning of the office, we have a little sliver to start and a really big board at the end of the office. So when you're doing multiple rooms, you can't always have it equal and not have a little sliver somewhere. So what you want to do is determine what is the most important areas to avoid that. Now, when you're considering that, in a lot of rooms, like if you look at this picture of my office, all the edges are actually covered up by furniture. And in most situations, the hallways are never covered up by furniture, or it's a very limited amount of furniture. Furthermore, it's not going to be that noticeable in a really big room, and your eye isn't going to be drawn to the edges of the room to be looking for that. However, in a narrow hallway, if that happens, you're really going to notice it. If there's a little sliver on one side, it's going to be much more noticeable, and it's going to draw your eye there. again, going to the value, what the masses are going to say, what the majority of people are going to find aesthetically pleasing, is if you have the best scenario in the hallway. So we only have one hallway, and obviously the hallway that is perpendicular to these lines is going to be fine. But when we're looking at this hallway, you can see we can have one big board there, or we can have half a board, but we want to avoid having a little sliver on one side and a big board on the other side. So that's the next thing you need to determine, is which hallway are you going to focus on and have the best outcome. After you've determined that, now I'm going to show you the math of how you can make sure that that hallway looks the best it possibly can. So you're going to need to make a reference line of where you want a seam of your boards. And the way you do that mathematically, and this will work for a hallway or a room, but we're going to focus on the hallway because that's where we're going to have this reference line. You're going to measure the distance of the hallway. So for hypothetical reasons, let's just say that distance is 10. You take whatever number you get and you divide it by 2. What that tells you is the distance from the outer edge to the very middle of the hallway. Now that we know what the half of the hallway distance is, you don't have to actually put the boards together, but I find it easiest to visualize. So if you start putting boards together and make the width bigger than the hallway, or at least half the hallway, you can now either measure from the edge over, or you can pick a seam in the boards you've put together and measure over from the right or left half the distance of the hallway. At the end of that measurement is going to show you what the last board is going to be like. And it's going to be symmetrical to where both the right and the left side of the hallway are going to have that width of a board, as you can see here in this visualization. And when you do this, you're going to have one of two possible outcomes. One is that last board on the edge is going to be equal to or greater than half of a plank of one board, or it's going to be less than half a plank. Now in this case, it's more than half a plank, so we're going to keep it as is. But in this next scenario, you'll see when the boards on the edge of the hallway are less than 1/2, or even just a little tiny sliver, it really doesn't look that good, and we want to avoid that. Now when you measure it and you see that that's happening, there's actually a pretty easy fix to this. Instead of putting the middle of the hallway on a seam, we're going to put it in the middle of a board. And that will make the outer edges look a lot better and be more than half a board. And all you need to do this is measure half the board over and move your seam over there. It can be in either direction. And this seam is going to be our reference line and what we base everything off of. For us, that works out to where if the seam is right on that line, that will be the biggest and best looking for this hallway, where on each side is a nice big fat piece of board and it's symmetrical and it's going to look best. So once you figure that out, then you know, okay, here's where the seam is going to be, and then you want to measure from one of the walls where that seam is and try to get as straight of a line as possible. So we were measuring from this wall, I forget what the exact measurement was, it was like 21 inches and a quarter or something. So we just measured 21 inches and a quarter off of this wall all the way to the other end, and we drew little Sharpie marks on it. Then we took our chalk line and we went relatively over those Sharpie marks and laid it down. And then I took a step back and looked at it and made sure that it looks straight. Now if it doesn't look straight, it's probably because your wall isn't straight, and you want your eye to think that it's straight. So adjust your chalk line before you snap it to look straight to your eye and to where you'll like it. You just want to create that nice straight line down your floor so you have a reference point of how all your pieces are going to line up. That's where I'm going to base everything off of, and it's all based off of this line. All right, so now that we have this line, there's a couple reasons I didn't want to start all the way over on the wall and work my way down like most of the videos will say. One reason was because that back wall was not a good starting point. It wasn't straight and it wasn't sturdy. So if we tried to hammer our pieces together and make them tight, that back drywall was going to crumble and move a little bit and not be secure. The other reason is I want to create a little door for that sump. So we actually started midway of the floor, and you want to have something to back it up onto, because you can see as Julian's like applying these, he's going to be hammering the vinyl so that it's flush. Those seams come together real nice. So as you hammer that, it's gonna push everything back. And if you don't have an anchor like what we did here, then it'll just keep pushing it back. So I'm on concrete, so we just drilled these, I think they're called tie-can screws right into the concrete and just made little scrap pieces to anchor this down so we have a nice backing. And we wanted to make sure that these seams are aligned with this line. So what I did was figured out how many boards would fit in between so we have an exact seam right on here. And it came to 8 boards, which was 67.5 inches for us. And the reason I chose that is just I needed it far enough back to where I could leave the space open. So you could have started way closer to the wall. So then with these 4 anchors, we measured 67.5 and then we anchored it down right there and screwed it into the floor so it couldn't move. But you get it straight relative to this line. So we know that the edge of each board as we come down here is parallel from this line right here. And now we have a base and we can just start installing and work our way all the way to the other wall, going through the hallway, going through the other room, and it'll all connect and work out. Now, these rooms might not be perfect to where you might have a sliver on the side, but the hallway won't, and that's where most people are gonna see and what is most important to me. The issue I ran into is, coming through the hallway here, it had a spacer there. You can see like how the drywall just moves. And then it's like sturdy here. So this isn't a sturdy backing even on this side. So as I go to tighten up this hallway and hammer in my stuff, what's gonna happen is it's gonna push back and start to go into that hallway and nothing's gonna tighten up. So I had to put another anchor block in my hallway to make sure that, hey, this stays in place. So as I am finishing out this hallway and tightening up by pushing this way, push this way and this way most of the time, that these aren't gonna move and everything isn't gonna come out of place and that it'll actually stay on this line. Because as you work your way down, I start putting pressure here, it's got backing over there, but not here. And then what'll happen is this line will start to be off on an angle and not work out the way that I wanted it to. Last things I'm gonna cover, right now I'm gonna tell you exactly how you actually install the floor. Then I'll cover, the biggest mistakes that people make, as well as some pro tips to make the floor install go smooth and efficiently. So you can see I'm actually putting in the floor here, and it's actually not that difficult. As I mentioned, you need to start in one corner and go to the end because of the way the locking mechanism works. So after you know the layout of your room and you put down the anchor points to start your first row, or perhaps you even just use the back wall to support your first row, you're going to put down a full first row. And when you get to the end, you're going to need to cut that last piece down to the right size. And it's not always going to be a clean just cut off straight with a razor blade. Sometimes you're going to have something intricate like what I'm showing you right here. So I'm going to run you through how you actually would make this cut so that the pieces all come together and work. The board you can see is too long. So the first thing you got to do is make sure you got your spacer up against the wall. Now, hey, if I put this up against the wall, I'm leaving space for my expansion, and it's also not too much space to where the baseboard or molding isn't going to cover. Now, this is the way the board's supposed to go. But if I were to just make this cut right here, because that would be the length, and you cut it like that, what's going to happen is you're going to get rid of this lip that connects here. So if you actually flip the board over, now when you cut off this end, that's the end that's going to be against the wall, which is fine to cut off that end. So make sure you flip the board over. I'm sure, especially if it's your first time, you're going to make that mistake often. But now you know, hey, this is where I need to cut the board so that it's the perfect length with the perfect amount of space over there. You also need to realize, are you cutting where the edge of the tongue is right there on this guy right here? Or are you going to use this line where the actual edge of the wood is? Because that edge of the wood needs to actually go over this tongue and actually grab there. So don't cut right here where the edge of like the lip and tongue groove is. You need to cut where the actual edge of the board is. So butt it up close against there, put your square right on that edge so you know, hey, this is a nice, clean, perfect line. Use an extra throwaway that I put under there so when I come off this, I don't gouge into good wood or my underlayment. Now I like to just use my foot and I put pressure with my hand, get it lined up perfect, so that way nothing moves, and then I just have a little bit of force going this way, so my blade stays tight up against my square. I do it twice to get a nice score to make it break easier. And then if you don't break the laminate this way, you want to break it away, so that I just like to use like my knee or something, and then just comes right apart real easy. You might have a little bit of a weird gouge, but that is going to be up against the wall with the spacer and covered by the baseboard. If you break it this way in, I just find that it doesn't make a clean cut there, and it can run into some issues. So now I know, hey, my board is the right length to where I have space and it lines up with the tongue and groove, got the right amount of space here. But now we've got the issue of where am I going to make this notch? Because obviously on this board I need to come down for the length of this wall, and then I need to run a straight line over to that wall. So to draw in those notches, you can use a piece of scrap wood, fine, and you're going to put it up against your spacer here, so you know, hey, it's the right amount of length for my notch to where it has room to expand and the baseboard's going to cover it. So make sure you're always using your spacer, and then make sure, you know, if one of your boards was cut, it's not a straight line, but this scrap board has the straight line out of the manufacturing, so always try to use your straight line when doing this. Now we're going to mark where we're going to start making this cut, which is right there. And I just find it easier with a block. I mean, you could use the square. You just want to make sure that, you know, you are square and not doing this kind of deal, when I find that just for me the block's a little easier. So now we know that's where we're going to start the cut, because we put the board up, push it up against the spacer. Alright, so now if we actually put that board in the tongue and groove, right? So like this is how this board, when we get a cut, is actually going to fit in there. We know like that's where it's going to be. So now we can figure out where do we need to cut it here. We're going to put it on this board and then transfer it to this board. So if we have our spacer there, and we're making sure, you know, hey, we're good, right there is where it's going to be. So I'm going to mark that. Alright, so now I'm going to put this board on top of this board here, make sure it's exactly lining up, and I'm going to make that mark. Alright, so now I'm going to use my square to make sure I'm getting a nice straight line. This basement was finished by the homeowner, and it was not a very good job, so I'm really counting on this wall probably not being straight. You know, the exterior walls are relatively straight, but the interior walls are comically crooked. Alright, so now we're just worried, is this wall straight? And I'll show you an easy way to know. We're going to take this board, and I'm going to put it on this tongue right here, and kind of use this to know if this is straight or not. At least straight to the way that my lines are going. So now that this is in there, nice and tight, good, I know that's straight. So then you're going to take your tape measure. I'm going to measure right here. I'm getting about 4 inches. Measure in the middle. I'm getting about 4 1/8. Measure in the back, and I'm getting 4 1/4. So I know that, hey, this wall actually tapers back towards the back, and you know, almost towards the full back. It's about 1/4 inch. So if I cut this straight down, my spacer is 1/4 inch. By the end, it's going to be 1/2 inch, which is the size of my baseboard. So I'm risking not having the baseboard cover this. So all that you need to do is measure right here, getting 3 7/8. So I need to subtract 1/4 inch. 2/8 is 1/4 inch, so I'm going to go to 5/8. So I'm going to go 3 5/8 back here, and I'm going to make my dot there. So now all I got to do is draw a straight line connecting those 2 dots. And I accounted for the wall not being straight, and I'll have a nice consistent expansion gap where it's got room to expand and contract, and the baseboard's going to cover, no problem. Now you can see I put down the board, and then I first seal the end seam with a rubber mallet. Then I put my tapping block on the edge. Now notice how I stand with my left foot on the other board and then tap it into place. The reason I'm standing now with my right foot and tapping it in is because it's going to want to push those boards back. So I'm using the weight of my body to keep that board steady, since all that's really holding it in place is a little spacer and some weak drywall. So make sure you stand on the row in front of the one you're installing to make sure when you're hammering the boards to lock them together, it's not making it push back or get cockeyed or twist or turn, and they stay pretty steady. Because in this room you can notice I didn't have those anchors, but see now when I was hammering there, I'm always standing on the boards behind it just to make sure that it has a little bit of backing. Now when you go to put down a new board, if you actually lift it up at a slight like 10 to 20 degree angle and slide it in, see how it's up on an angle? Now I start tapping it in and watch, it'll actually drop down. That's how you know it's locking into place. And when you tap it in, that seam, at least for this product, literally like disappears. And if the print's really similar, you can sometimes not even see where the seam is, which is pretty awesome. Now, I tried to end the joints up tight together, but sometimes they aren't perfect. So if you take your pull bar and then you actually put your weight on it and stand with your foot, it seems to work better. Just give it a couple taps with the hammer and then go check the seam, and it should be flush and disappeared. Just like the edges, the ends should look the same. If not, give it a couple more taps with your rubber mallet and you'll see, at least for me, it completely disappeared to where you can barely even see it, and it's nice and tight and you know your flooring is good. Now you can move on to installing the next piece. You can see when I go to install the next piece, I really try to line up the end so that it is flush, so that I don't have to use that pull bar. And I would say 90% of the time you don't have to, but sometimes when you're locking it in and you tap it together, it tends to pull out just a little bit, and you can see a little tiny 30-second of a gap in between those seams. So give it a couple more taps, make sure everything's nice and tight, and you'll be good to go. Now when I open up this new box, I'm looking through the boards and looking at the pattern or the print that's on there. There was probably like 6 different prints on this particular product, but they were in different areas and sometimes reversed or flipped around. So you just want to make sure that you don't install 2 boards that are identical right next to each other, whether that's to the right, left, top, or bottom. So you want to look for that when you're putting down your board. You'll even notice sometimes I put down a board and then I move it and put a different board down, and I'm doing it because I'm trying to avoid that pattern repeat. The other thing you want to consider is you don't want your seams to be staggered in a perfect pattern. You want them to be kind of random. You also want to make sure that you have, at least for this product, I believe it was 6-inch distance between the seams, and that's just for the structural integrity, to make sure that it's strong and that the seams aren't going to come undone with kicking and scuffing the floor with your shoes. Now you can see when you just have a square room, it's actually pretty easy. You're just repeating the same thing over and over again, and you don't have any intricate cuts to make, so you can do it all with a razor blade and it goes pretty smooth and efficiently. Unless you do this for a living every day, in my opinion, if you try to rush the job, you're actually going to create more time and more material waste. The reason I learned this is I actually paid a buddy to help me install this floor, and because he's a really nice guy, he wanted to go as quick as he could to get me a good value. But what we found was a lot of mistakes get made when you try to go quickly, which leads me into my next topic, which is the biggest and most common mistakes beginners are going to make. What you don't want is this, to where you're going to be able to see the floor isn't underneath the baseboard and there's going to be gaps there. And also when you're trying to get these seams tight and you're hammering it down, so if you go to this other end and you start using the pull bar to hammer it this way, it's going to move all the way into the wall unless you have the spacer there, and then it's going to be too close to the wall there. So those spacers are perfect, gives you plenty of room to cover with your baseboard, as well as gives you a backing so you can use it to hammer into and make all the seams tight. Another thing you want to be careful of is just trying to go too fast and being rough. We're using this block and within 5 minutes it was broken, so take your time, be careful. And then, if you're trying to go too quick and stuff, like you can see the floor is broken here, where on the edge it's all chipped up. And if that does happen, just replace the board, don't keep going, because now it creates more work to have to go back through and replace it. You need to make sure between the end of your board and where your other type of flooring starts, that transition piece is going to cover, and make sure that it fits, so that you don't have gaps. So my buddy decided to skip this little knockout in the room, and the reason he did that is because it was going to be difficult and he wanted to get a lot of work done and go fast. Now, you don't want to skip things because if you do it wrong, you have to go back and fix it, and in this case he did do it wrong. What he did was he cut the board straight down and on the bottom cut off this locking mechanism here so that you can't keep going. You can't connect another board to the end of that piece. So instead of cutting it straight down, what he should have done was made these L-shaped notches and cut it with a jigsaw. That's why he skipped it, because he knew it was going to be tough, but now that we can't finish it out, you actually have to tear up all the floor and go all the way back to that spot to finish, which you can see I did here. So it actually created a ton more time by trying to go too quick. So when you're going around corners, make sure you don't do this mistake, and I would just recommend finishing everything so everything behind you is just done and you know it's correct and you can move on. This is probably a rare situation, but when you have a board where you're actually cutting out a slot in the middle, or in this case on both sides of the middle, you got to remember you can't actually slide this board underneath. So you can see I took a ton of time measuring here, making sure my cuts were great, and I'm like, great, I'm going to use one board, it's going to look so good. And then as soon as I got done, I go to actually install it and I realize, oh, it's a wedge, I can't slide it in from the side, there's no way I can actually make this work, I just wasted a ton of time. Now you might be thinking you can just cut the board in half and it'll work, but then where you actually cut it in half, it's just two butt end joints connected and there's no locking mechanism there, so that actually won't work. So the solution was I had to take a board that I finished a row with so that the end piece has the locking mechanism and the beginning piece can start a new row. I transferred the cuts I made onto the beginning part and then slid that under the door. Now I need to take a full board so that both on the right and left side there's the locking mechanism, and I need to figure out where to transfer my cuts from the previous board that I just cut in half and had to trash onto that full board. So that way it'll slide up underneath the hallway, and then the left side will connect to the end of the board that I've already installed, as you can see here. But then on the far right side of that board, the end of the hallway is going to be a little sliver and it's going to have that locking mechanism on there. Now I'm going to have to rip real skinny boards so that I can finish out that row and then start a completely new row. Here's that little skinny sliver piece on the other side that I need to finish that out and go all the way to the wall so I can start a new row. Sometimes when you're connecting the boards, you try to get the seams to be flush and you'll notice there's a little gap, and for some reason, even when you're tapping it in, it doesn't want to go in. This is most common because there's some dirt or grit that has gotten into that groove. And a big thing that causes this is if you're cutting the board with a saw, it creates plastic little particles that go everywhere, and sometimes those fall into the groove, preventing you from being able to lock it in place. So the pro tip here is make your saw cuts when you're not cutting with a razor blade in a different area, like I was doing it in the garage. And even after I was done cutting it, I took a little towel and I wiped the board off, because a lot of those plastic particles, because I think of static electricity, want to stick to the board. So wipe off your cut edge really clean and get all those particles off so it's less likely to happen. If it does happen, all you have to do is clean out that little groove. I happen to have a shop vac right there, so I was just vacuuming out the seams. But later I learned that it was actually a lot easier and quicker to just carry a paintbrush with me at all times. And when I try to connect the board, if it wouldn't go in, I just pull it out, wipe that seam clean with my brush, as you can see here, and then it would install really easy. And I just found that to be a lot quicker and more efficient. Just carry one of those on you and you're good. Another pro tip is sometimes when you cut off the end of a board to finish a row, you're not going to use that exact board to start the next row because it's going to repeat a pattern or the seams will be too close. So you're going to put that board in a pile. And I have two piles, a pile where the right side of the board has the locking mechanism and another pile where the left side of the board has the locking mechanism. And you can pick from those two piles and decide, hey, these are all my starting row piles and these are all my ending row piles, which is just going to cut down on waste and make the job a little easier for you. When you get to the end of a room, a lot of times you have to rip a really thin board to finish it out. Now when this happens, the board has a tendency to want to pop out of the seam like this, especially on my floor, because I had an extreme case where for some reason my slab ended and then the concrete slab from outside started and they weren't level as shown here. So I actually tried to fill that with foam, which was a big mistake, and then cut that foam down so that it was flat. But that foam isn't strong, so when I step on that edge seam, it wants to pop it out, and it just didn't want to stay in place. The other area that this actually happened was when you're working backwards, like where I made those anchor points. Sometimes when you try to put in that last piece, it has a tendency to want to break the locking mechanism, and then it doesn't stay in as good. It wasn't extreme as the other side, but surprisingly, super glue works really well. So you can see this back row I'm putting in right now. It didn't want to stay down, but as soon as I put super glue on the edges, it was surprisingly secure, and I haven't had an issue since. So there's another pro tip for you. So that's how you install the floor. You'd actually be surprised, this stuff is really durable. As you can see here, I have super heavy stuff on it, like an aquarium that weighs thousands of pounds, and it hasn't really even dented it. So I'm really impressed with it, and it's really versatile. You know, I made some pretty intricate cuts on stuff like this to where it worked out great, and I haven't had an issue with it. And you know, you can pretty much do anything if you put your mind to it. You're gonna have to do a lot of measuring and use paper to make templates. Like that's how I made this circle and stuff, but it all stays together really good, and I'm really impressed with it and would definitely recommend it. I have hardwood in my kitchen, and this is much more durable than that. My dog scratches it up. You drop a can on it, it puts a dent in it. You know, you leave water there, it starts to warp. Like, I don't think I'd ever use hardwood again, unless it just deteriorates quickly. But I've had it for about 6 months now, and I'm super happy with it.